Hello everybody, I'm here today with Heath Davies, who's very kindly agreed to spend a little bit of time with me and talk to me about the interesting journey that a lot of businesses are going through to go from being on-prem to SaaS. A little bit of introduction to who Heath is. Over the last decade or so, give or take, he's spent some time working with the Sword Group, which was at the time a public listed company out in France. He's also spent some time working with a UK FTSE listed organisation in the role of CEO. But if we go into the more recent experiences, which are probably quite pertinent for this conversation, he's worked with two PE-backed organisations, ClearSwift and also Exclaimer. So if I look at those interesting deep sort of depths of experiences, what is interesting that comes through is there's two organisations that he's worked with that have gone through that SaaS transformation. So over to you, Heath. Why don't you talk to me a little bit about where you first picked up learning about SaaS and how did you get involved in this?
Thanks, Ruby, and thanks for having me on again. Now, probably the best place for me to start on this is if we go back to that French company you mentioned, which was Sword Group. And it was really there that I started to get an understanding of what SaaS was all about. Because back in 2007 or 2008, I think it was, we acquired a company called CT Space. It was based in San Francisco. And it was about 10 million in revenue at the time. So it had some scale. And you have to think back to 2008, this is when SaaS was really in its infancy. We had obviously the likes of Salesforce.com starting to get some traction, but it was really early days. And I felt at that point there was something happening in the industry that I wanted to be part of. And we acquired this business and the learning was enormous. I mean, when I think back to what I had to go through at that point, having come from a software and a services environment, going in then to a native SaaS environment was transformational. It was things around pricing. You come from a traditional big ticket software business, large deals up front, long tail of maintenance behind it. And then you get into a SaaS world and it was all compressed into much smaller, smoother value deals, but spread out over a very long period of time. The other things that were different were things like support, where traditional software, you'd be in there, you'd be reacting to a customer, calling up about a particular problem. And what I found with SaaS was that I actually got to be more proactive, make sure the customer's deriving value from the product, almost from day one that you would have shifted it. Another major learning, of course, was in engineering and product management. Where you would have traditionally gone from these huge monolithic releases that you'd be bringing out every 6 months. And now, of course, they were into much smaller feature fixes that were being done every month or in some cases every day even. And I suppose one of the most scary factors was coming from a traditional software environment where when you're selling to a customer, you'd basically be selling the deal, you'd set the product and then you'd forget it effectively. But of course, moving into a SaaS world, it's far easier now for a customer to swap out a vendor. So a lot more attention was going to be paid into the customer success side of the house. So those core tenets, if you like, of what I learned during those early days of SaaS allowed me then in much later years to come in and help the transformations. And that sort of grounding was invaluable to help me through the last two transitions that I've done.
Thank you, Heath. I mean, that's really insightful, and it kind of takes me on to my next question, which is, it sounds like a lot of hard work. So what are the perceived benefits of making this fundamental change? And I'd like to ask you, if I may, to answer that from three lenses. One is one from the organization itself, their perspective. The second is from the investor's perspective, or the primary shareholders. And the third is from the customer's perspective.
Okay, let me start with something that may be a little provocative, and it really underlines the sort of fundamental transition that's happening to SaaS in the world at the moment. I believe if you don't move off a pure play software platform into SaaS, it will fundamentally undermine the value of your business going forward, even undermine the survival of your business going forward. So what kind of leads me to this, I guess, is that, you know, there is this shift happening. And I think for me, I'm looking at a lens maybe out over the next sort of 10 years that we've got the opportunity to make this transition. Otherwise, software companies that are trying to compete with SaaS, they won't be able to compete on things like price or performance or feature set or service levels that are inherent within the economies of scale that come from a SaaS environment today. I think the other thing is that they'll end up struggling to keep their existing customers as SaaS competition gets stronger in the market, starts offering more features more quickly. And I think they'll also struggle to win net new customers. And I think the existing customers, they're going to suffer with being on legacy environments that are going to be fraught with patching issues, security challenges, and all of that together with having staff that are now going to want to work on modern platforms. You're going to struggle to get them on these aging platforms. So from my perspective, this transition is a matter of survival for the software companies today. Now, how does it impact those various stakeholders you mentioned? Well, of course, it does impact them in many different ways. And I think if you look at it from an organization perspective, then you're at best probably going to stagnate from a company perspective. And at worst, and probably most likely, you're going to end up declining. You'll end up declining in revenue. You're going to have higher staff churn, and you're going to end up having higher customer attrition. So I think the outlook from an organization perspective isn't particularly good. I think from an investor perspective, you'll see the organization enterprise value eroding, and ultimately the attractiveness to future potential suitors is also going to fall away as buyers are starting to look more towards the SaaS environment than they would do to the traditional software. And then, of course, you've also got to consider the customer. And I fear that the customer will be experiencing reduced service levels. They're having slower feature releases. It'll make them less competitive against their competition in the market that are using SaaS-based products. And that, I'm afraid, means that the customer base will also ultimately end up attriting and moving away onto new platforms. Now, what does that actually mean? I don't think it's all gloom and doom, although I presented it in such a way. I say it on the basis that I think the good news here is that there is a transition that can happen between now and that next 10 years to keep your software company viable. But it does require you to start the transition to SaaS, and you really need to start thinking about that journey now. And when I think about it, the two SaaS deals that I've been on in terms of transition have both taken around 5 years from that initial inception through to where you've got maybe a fully compatible offering that competes with your on-premise value proposition today. So I think the thought here is get your skates on, because there isn't time to waste.
Thank you. From an investor perspective, just leading on from that question, what are the key challenges this kind of transformation could have? I mean, whether it's from a financial cash flow revenue model perspective, or the investment timeline, or even ultimately the exit multiple perspective.
Yeah, challenges or perhaps clarifications, because for a lot of investors, this journey is fairly new. They either know software or they know about SaaS. And actually, you're basically smashing together two of those fundamental business types. Now, the first thing, really, when you start on the road to SaaS from being on-premise, is if you're starting from ground zero, that means you've only got an on-premise product today, right? Then you'll need to think about the initial project to create a minimum viable product. And this typically takes somewhere between, say, 12 and 18 months in my experience. Now, the timescale depends on the complexity of the solution. And as I mentioned earlier, it's then 4 to 5 years of work to create that sort of comparable product offering. But you need to fund that initial part of the MVP in order that you can get something that's running in parallel with your on-premise product today. And that obviously needs to be costed and funded out. A call out here, though, is that quite often people think you've got to build a SaaS-based product that's exactly the same as your on-premise product, and that absolutely isn't the case. Things you would have put into the product originally for on-premise now are no longer valued or are no longer needed. And I think if you look at somewhere between 70 to 80% as a match to be compatible with your on-premise product, that typically is enough to get customers to move across. Now that funding window, whilst you're doing the MVP, of course, that's all cash out, but typically you would expect to get to a break-even point somewhere between 24 and 36 months. So that's something that an investor that's coming into this market looking to transition needs to be thinking about. The second thing I'd probably talk about is the impact on the P&L. And this goes back to my learning a bit earlier. This is where, you've got an on-premise product that you're getting a large cash flow, which is quite lumpy and spiky for perpetual-based deals. But actually, it goes directly to your P&L as revenue and profit. And obviously, you get the cash benefit that comes in as a result of that as well. Now, of course, moving into the SaaS world, you are going through a much smoother, more predictable cash flow profiling, but it's much lower initial receipts. And obviously, the revenue now gets spread out over a 12-month period rather than it being directly in the month that revenue was booked. So, the impact is going to be visible on your P&L from revenue, EBITDA, and free cash flow generation. And getting to grips with this is important. I think the next thing for me would be about the KPIs, and this actually is really quite challenging. The KPIs that you use for measuring a software business or a service business are different, but they're also very much different as well when you start thinking about a SaaS-based business. And getting to grips with this is like really important. And to give you an example, if I think about revenue, which we just mentioned, I could split revenue into the revenue as it is. I could split it into monthly recurring revenue. I could split it into annual recurring revenue, gross revenue retention, net revenue retention, and many other revenue measures that give me an insight and an optic into what's happening in the company today. So you need to agree on what's important and what you need to measure there. And then you've got your financial metrics, but then you've also got your operational metrics. And these are things like, my cost of customer acquisition, my CAC value, or my CAC value and payback, and what ratios I want, or my customer lifetime value versus my CAC value, and what ratio that should look like. And something as well, I suppose, that's different between a native SaaS company and one that's in transition is my net customer acquisition. Because if you think about it, if I only have a native SaaS-based product, then all my customers are new. But if I've got a migration pot, which is my future stored potential, and I'm migrating customers off my on-prem to my SaaS platform, then how many net new am I really winning? Because I need to understand that in order that I can tune the dials, etc. So now that's just a few of the considerations, but I think it underlies the complexity of what needs to be looked at when you move from one sort of pure play software into a SaaS-based environment. But, I certainly think, based on my experience of the last two deals, that transition is hugely valuable. You mentioned, what's the exit consideration and values? Well, if you think about the FTSE market today and you look at the average of the tech stocks across that group, between software and services, there is a blend, but it gives you a valuation proxy, if you like, for understanding what your business may be worth today. You'll see the average value somewhere around 20 times EBITDA. However, if you use the SaaS Bessemer VP index, which is a NASDAQ measure that's an indicator for valuations on the relatively small SaaS companies, so maybe less than 5 million, you'll see that the valuations there are over 20 times revenue. So the dynamic is huge, and even a very small base SaaS company can command quite huge equity values. And I don't think this is something that's going to stop either. I was reading a report in August produced by Gartner, and they were talking about the growth in the SaaS market continuing apace, and expect it between 2020 and 2022. The compound annual growth rate is over 20% in just the pure play SaaS transformation. So There's definitely a lot of legs left in this market yet, and this is something that's definitely worth doing to transition from on-prem into the cloud.
It's very interesting you say that, because one of the things that we've seen from a number of M&A advisors, investment directors, the themes that keep consistently coming through is there's, especially in the tech market space, the compression number that used to be the difference between software businesses and services businesses, the multiple you get, that delta difference is now dwindling. It's becoming smaller and smaller. And the other thing that we're seeing that is coming through consistently is more and more deals are being done on a multiple of revenue, not EBITDA. So I think, you know, both those sort of themes that you picked up, we've seen over the last, I'd say, 6 months really come through to forefront.
Sure.
On the transformation scheme piece, sorry, that we were talking about just a few minutes ago, you made one comment that about customer experience, and I just want to touch on that. Is it challenging to convince customers to migrate to cloud native offering and undergo that transformation? And what's some of the challenges involved in that?
So for customers, I think it's all about perception. And what I mean by that is that there is a belief within a customer base that a SaaS or cloud product, as they may call it, is less expensive to procure than a traditional on-premise solution. And due to the economies of scale, that this should ultimately be true. It should be less expensive to buy a SaaS product than to house it all yourself. The trouble is that some customers try and compare the value of your SaaS product to what they paid for your on-premise software license. And of course, there's a huge disparity there, right? You know, they've not only got to be thinking about that software value, you really need to start educating them on, okay, it's the hardware, it's the storage, it's the operating system, it's the backup, it's the archive. Oh, and once you've got all of that, it's all the staff that I need to employ in order to run this 24/7 to give you a service level that's 999.49s, right? So that's all about perception. That can be overcome by giving a clear and concise comparison between the sort of all the infrastructure costs blended together with the resources, so that prospects and clients can see, well, actually, this isn't just about software, it's everything else that I've got in my stack. So I think, again, it is about perception and where customers are on that cloud journey. I must say, over the last sort of couple of years, that sort of education process has got a lot easier. What's actually got a lot more complex with customers over the last couple of years has really been around the security aspect. I mean, security touches everyone and everything now. The data protection that we've all got to be mindful of, the breaches that have happened around the world, etc. And of course, my former company was all in security as well. So I've got a very good understanding of the dynamics in this market. And for a lot of IT managers or CIOs or IT pros, they really like that touchy-feely, tactile thing of being able to go up to a server and stroke it and say, you know, I can look after you. But of course, I'm moving all of that to the cloud now, and they become nervous about, you know, who's going to access that data? And where is that data going to be resident? You know, the governance and jurisdictional controls of it. And to be honest, those jurisdictional controls can really be quite acute in certain regions around the world that can block a deal. I mean, I've had several deals blocked in Germany and Japan and the UAE because I couldn't give them regional jurisdictional governance. So, but I think in time, again, that will change. And certainly I've seen signs in Germany with other indicators that the SaaS market is definitely picking up there. And I think in time, they will all pick up. And I think how we have dealt with that in the past is by having, in my former business, a SecOps team that basically go through and describe exactly what was happening. Within a TechOps team as well, you can sort of set out the security statements. And in some markets, like financial services, they'll want to go to another level of having sort of certification around SOC 2 or SOC 3 compliance, etc. So I think that's another major factor that's in the mix at the moment. And I think the final one, and I'm certainly acutely aware of this, is to do with the issue of performance and usability And this really is where I've seen the lines blurring between the B2C market and B2B, with customer expectations now being actually B2B software, SaaS or otherwise, should be as reliable and easy to use as commodity market software. And this then, in addition to the core functionality of the product you're selling, you've got to think about ease of use, you've got to think about uptime, you've got to think about zero bugs. And it really is that sort of commoditization, if you like, of B2B software coming into the business to consumer world. I think you can offset those concerns as well now by getting customers to look at your Net Promoter Score. That's a big help. To look at your CSAT survey, or to look at peer-to-peer groups like G2 Crowd, for example, and that helps to alleviate customer concerns in this particular area. So yes, there are lots of things that customers tend to be concerned about, but with the maturity of the SaaS-based environment today, there are ways to mitigate those concerns.
Thank you, Heath. What about from the organization itself? When you are going through that transformation, I would have thought there's a bit of a cultural transformation that needs to take place as you facilitate the SaaS transformation. Could you share some insight into that, please?
Yeah, I'll go back to my first transformation here, which is started in 2012. And again, this may be something that some of your viewers may be contemplating themselves. And this is it's a fundamental point, a fundamental cultural point, is that can I really take my on-premise company with its management and staff and culture into a SaaS world? And absolutely, in my experience, I found this is completely possible, providing you augment the team with some new skills which may be brought in that the team don't have today, or they're taught those skills. And they also need new tooling as well in order to help them to create that sort of SaaS environment. So I think that's the first thing, is that you can definitely transition with the majority of staff that you've currently got, because you need that business know-how to be transitioned into this new SaaS environment. Once you've got your head around that, you then need to consider the operational challenges that impact on the culture and the behaviors within the business. And I think when I've been learning about this from that sort of SaaS native environment, I've kind of looked to employ that learning into the individual functional groups. So if we take, for example, engineering and product management, it's about getting a mindset away from, okay, I'm going to release this monolithic product every 6 months, into, well, actually now we need to think about releasing every month. That's a real mindset shift. Or I'm taking a product that my sales guys used to sell. You now need to give me a product that my customers can self-service on, and it's going to have zero touch from the sales team. Or indeed, actually, I now want my product to sell other products, moving into the product-led growth paradigm, which is also really interesting because the product helps to cross-sell and upsell, etc. So that really is quite a mindset shift, and that's why the teams need new skills and new tooling to help them achieve that objective. So that's one package of sort of engineering and product management. The next one for me, which perhaps is the one that takes the most understanding, is around the service element. Now, quite often the managers of software businesses perceive SaaS as like a simple subscription type model, and just I'll take my on-premise product, we'll do some engineering with it, and we'll just give it to the customers to use. Clearly, this isn't SaaS, and we should remember that there are two S's in SaaS. One is for software, and the other one is for service, and they're both as equally important. And service sometimes gets kind of misunderstood that, it's just a help desk. No, you do need a super help desk as well. But it's also about giving the company the ability to reach out to their customers in a proactive way, to make sure that they're implementing the solution to get the maximum value in the shortest period of time. Because obviously you need those customers to stay with you so that you hit your customer lifetime value, you have low churn, etc., etc. So support and service is a really big part of the story. And again, the next part for me is really about the sort of go-to-market. At the front end, you've got marketing needing to work smarter now to raise awareness of your value proposition in a digital marketing space. And that's been especially true during, obviously, the pandemic. because no one's been allowed to go to trade shows, etc. And of course, it's a very, very crowded marketplace. Next, you need to think about pricing, price elasticity. You need to think about tiering and bundles. And these are all considerations that need to be worked through and ultimately communicated to your sales team as well. Historically, that's all my sales team or myself have had to deal with is, okay, what's the price of the product? How many seats have you got, Mr. Customer? How long do you want the maintenance contract? Okay, sign here. Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward. Now I've got to go in and say, okay, what level of product tier do you need? Do you need good, better, or best? Do you need that good, better, or best with your entire enterprise, or do you need a different level for each individual department? And are you going to make sure that they all run coterminously, or do you want to have renewals starting at different dates? And oh, by the way, how do you like to pay for it? Do you want to pay for it monthly or annually? And would you like to pay for it on credit card, debit, or direct debit, or would you like to have an invoice? Now, all of those conversations, of course, are going to be new for an existing sales team that have just been used to selling an on-premise deal that's got a one-times upfront and maybe a 3 or 4 year maintenance contract. So I've only kind of touched on 3 areas there that impact on the culture, but they probably are some of the biggest areas that are created in transitioning a business from on-prem to SaaS. That, of course, SaaS vendors that are SaaS native don't have to deal with this complexity.
Really, really interesting. And I appreciate you've only just, touched the tip of the iceberg on that, but that's a really interesting insight. Another question I have for you is, if you were tasked with executing a on-prem to SaaS transformation tomorrow, what would you do differently from what you did before? So, you've got this rich tapestry of experiences. It'd be great to just get some insight around that.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and probably like all good CEOs, you're always reflecting after your last deal or your last major strategic event. What could I have done? What could I have done differently? And I think for the last 2 that I've done, there is a common theme that underpins both of them. That going in, if I was to do another one, I would definitely take more time and look at this. And this really, it kind of links to the former point about culture. And this is about where I would communicate the internal messaging for the company to move from cloud first to cloud only more quickly. So what does that actually mean? Well, historically, what I've done is I said, okay, we've been on premise, but now we're going to be cloud first. Now, this basically tells the organization, of course, that cloud's really important, and we're going to promote this above our on-premise offering. But actually, if a customer wants on-premise, you're going to sell it to them anyway, right? So that's a kind of get out of jail card, and it's a bit of a compromise. Whereas if you go cloud only, of course, you are definitely only selling a cloud offering. And this does require a shift in the organizational psyche in order to truly deliver yourself into a SaaS company. And you might say, well, why didn't you just do it anyway? Why didn't you just go in and say, right, we're cloud only day one? Well, it does have its challenges, of course, because prospects that want an on-premise solution that have been coming to you maybe for decades, now you're going to tell them, well, actually, you can't have that on-prem. We can sell you a cloud. And they may say, well, I don't want cloud. So what happens is the on-premise customer ends up going to maybe one of your competitors. Or you go to a customer that has an existing contract with you and it's renewal time. And you say, oh, Mr. Customer, just to let you know, we're end of lifing the product next year or 2 years or whatever it happens to be. And we need you to migrate. And they say, well, no, we don't want to migrate. Actually, we're going to think about moving. And this goes back to my earlier point about the ability to be able to switch very quickly. So now, of course, you're going to be losing a customer that's on-prem, go into another on-prem that ultimately will go to cloud. So it becomes a real challenge as to knowing when you should do this for your organization, so that you should really be focusing in on the cloud story as at 100%. And of course, that the upside of when you make that switch is that all of your energy and effort and all the training for marketing, sales, support, engineering, customer success, etc., are now all focused on the cloud, which ultimately gets an increase in productivity. And I think when I think back about the number of deals that I really lost for saying that I was moving to cloud only, in my experience, is so insignificant. It's far more offset by the value you gain by being in the cloud. So the key to all this, of course, would be is knowing when should I make this switch, and it's not just a question of internally looking at my product saying, okay, my on-premise product, my SaaS product is almost 70-80% of my on-premise product today, so I'm ready technically. You also need to think more about macroeconomic trends, for example, in different territories. As I mentioned earlier, you know, if you wanted to sell into Japan, you might want to leave that right till the end and leave your on-premise solution just to service that particular country. You also need to think about different sectors as well, and their acceptance of the cloud. You know, governments and military organizations are very much laggards in that move to the cloud because they've obviously got some super sensitive information. And if they do go cloud, it'll be captive cloud, not public cloud. And you've got to factor all of that in before you ultimately say, right, I'm going to do it now. But at the back of your mind, you also need to be thinking about, well, I need to think about how long I've got to run these solutions in parallel. And for me, it was a 10-year overlap. And I personally think now you can probably do that in half the time by becoming far more focused and taking all the measures. And of course, the market's matured a lot since 2012 when I first started looking at this. And I think you probably could get away now with about a 5-year window of overlap between your on-prem and your full-blown SaaS product.
Thank you. Just on picking up on that theme about trends, what permanent changes, if any, do you think the pandemic has had on businesses and how they operate?
Yeah, well, I suppose firstly we should not forget that we're not all through this yet. The world is still having bumps. And although I think there are signs of normality returning, we do have to keep an eye on those developments that could come in and reverse some of the gains that we've made recently. And I think I've got that mindset because of having worked in a security market where we were protecting against viruses. I'm acutely aware that viruses mutate in order to avoid the detection, right? So we do have to be mindful of that. Now, that said, of course, we have all come through what has been a very testing time in business and personally as well. I guess we've all learned a lot. And whilst we're not through all of this yet, I still think, despite this fact, there are some things that have changed for good. And I think the one thing I would call out is the future of remote working. And it's probably front and foremost of most chief execs' minds at the moment. And, you know, for me, I am a fan of this new working paradigm for sure. But I'm also aware that we need to adapt our organizations to accommodate this new working pattern. And we need to think about what rules and regulations and guidelines need to be established for the employees to understand what their obligations are, when and when not to come into the office. We need to think about how we're going to onboard staff and develop them, how we're going to bring existing teams in to be the best that they can be. And I know from my own perspective, I think, oh, well, you know, I've got experience of having done this through the pandemic, nearly doubling the size of the headcount during my last business. But actually, do you know, this was actually easier because we basically told everyone, go and work from home. And now we're saying, come on back. Well, only if you want to. And I don't know what day of the week, and if you want to go and work from the beach, that's fine as well. You know, it's a bit of a mess at the moment. And again, I was reading, in fact, earlier this week, there was an article by Amazon. The headline was, Amazon to allow employees to work remotely indefinitely. I was like, wow, who's going to pack all the boxes? Have they got robots to do it all? You know, when you get into the article, you actually realize it's only for the tech and corporate workers. And actually in the small print, it says that they will also need to come into the office should their department head decide it. And then you counterpose that against someone like Morgan Stanley, where their chief exec said earlier this year, make no mistake about it, everyone works inside Morgan Stanley. Be at your desk from September. It's like, you know, there are really conflicting ends of the spectrum here. So that's the biggest concern for me, and it is changing for sure. And this, you know, it's the new norm is how do we keep the staff engaged, feel part of that company culture. And I'm convinced we still need to work through that as well. But the one thing that life has taught me, having gone through a few crises before, from maybe the Y2K millennium bug, if you remember that one, the dot-com boom and crash, of course, in 2000, financial crisis back in 2007-8. What it's taught me is that businesses adapt, they become resilient to that change, and I'm confident that we will be able to do the same again in that sort of post-pandemic world.
Thank you very much, Heath. I genuinely have enjoyed talking to you, as always. It's been a pleasure. Lots of really, really interesting insights that you provide, which I'm sure, whether you're watching this from an investor's perspective, a customer perspective, or maybe even a CEO just about to embark on this journey, or somebody part of that management team, there's been some really interesting insights there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me on, Ruby.